So I want to talk about a valuable item that is used in television production, and that is going to be lights and lighting. And you can't pretty much see without lights. So in a television studio, you have like all these little instruments that you can kind of see hanging from the ceiling above my head. And these are going to allow us the ability to shape and change the way we look at things in the studio. Mainly because when we're dealing with lights and lighting, we're dealing with what we can see. If it's the naked eye or if it's going to be through a camera, all these images that we see get basically converted into it's because of a light that's being reflected off of that and going into our eye or through a camera lens. So when you see an object like an apple, you're looking at an entire spectrum of white light. And so when we combine multiple colors like red, yellow, green, blue, violet, and all the others on a white surface, that light bounces off that surface and then it goes into your eye. And this allows you to see everything that was at that surface. Now, if we move something off of a white surface and onto a black surface, this black surface is now going to absorb that light and not reflect it, which is why darker clothes are harder to see than lighter clothes, or why it's harder to see things at night than during the day, because the light is being absorbed by everything around it. Now, if we want to see something particular, like this apple here, and this apple has a red coat. So what then happens is the entire spectrum of white light goes to that red surface, and then that surface absorbs every color except for red. Or if it's going to be in the case of the leaf on the apple, it's going to absorb every color except for green. And what it doesn't absorb, it then bounces off and reflects that towards your eye. And once it gets to your eye, it goes through the pupil, and then the lens is going to focus that ray of light onto the back of the eyeball, where these sensors are called cones and rods that are able to receive the light and interpret the image and the colors so that you see a red apple. And you not just red, but you see the shape of it, and you can see everything around it. You can also see the green stem. So you can see all this at the same time, because these objects are absorbing white light and reflecting a particular color back at you. Same way with an orange, or sorry, with a banana. As this banana starts off in its younger forms, it tends to have a green skin. And then as it ages, the color of the skin changes from green to yellow to brown to black. And as that does, the light wave and the colors that it absorbs versus what it reflects change as well. So at this point, you see yellow bananas because it's absorbing all the colors of the light spectrum except for what makes up yellow. And so this is basically how we're able to see objects in and around our environment. And we can't see any of this without light. And likewise, neither than a camera. Now, a camera has a sensor called a CCD, a charged coupled device, and it's less sensitive than your eyes, but it does the same concept in that when light or an image hits that charged coupled device, and you kind of see it here in the bottom left, that it has sensors to record blue and green and red, and it separates those in those three different channels. And then when you go back to edit or play something back, it can recall those three channels, combine them in the appropriate ratios to give you the image that you can work with. So one of the things that we talk about when we're looking at things or viewing things is what's known as a contrast ratio. And this talks about how big of a difference you can see between something that's dark and something that's light. Now, the human eye, we deal with two ratios at the same time. The first one is known as a static ratio and has a very narrow field between the dark and the light that it can see. And what you're basically doing is when you look at something with your eye will focus on something for a very small area and for a very brief moment of time. And then it'll start kind of looking around and picking up different things around those points, and that kind of builds that image. And with this, we're able to get crystal clarity in a small area. Now, another type of ratio that we have is our field of view. So this is the everything that's happening around you, your peripheral vision. And this has a much greater dynamic ratio of nearly 1,000,000 to 1. But with your peripheral view, I'm not seeing things in clarity as I am with that static ratio. So your mind is able to take these two and combine them together to give you a full range of contrast ratios. And because you have the static, which has a narrow, the dynamic, which has a very wide range, you're able to do things like look at both indoors and outdoors at the same time. So inside my office, it's not as bright in here as it is outside my window. But through the dynamic ratio and the static ratio, I'm able to look at my office and I can see clearly everything in front of my desk, and then I can also see everything outside. Now, a camera is not as good as a human eye. It cannot handle the two separate ratios. It's either going to be one or the other. So the contrast ratio for a camera is going to run about 1,000 to 1 or about 2,500 to 1. And so because of this, if I look outside my window, again, I'm able to see everything inside my office. I can see a laptop, flowers, I can see my files, and then I can look through the window where things are much brighter, and I can see everything outside the window as well. Now with the static, if I try to do that, or if I use the camera and I need to see everything inside the office, I'm going to have to take the iris and open it up and let in more light. And when I do that, everything outside becomes a lot brighter, and it becomes too bright for the camera to really see or differentiate what's going on. So this image is getting overexposed. So if I wanted to see what's happening outside with the static ratio, I'll take my iris and I'll close it so that less light is coming in. Now, when this happens, I now can see outside where it's much brighter. But if you notice on the inside, things have gotten a lot darker. So I'm having a hard time seeing the laptop or the flower or the files or the phone because the camera can't handle those two separate static ratios. So when your camera's trying to adjust, it's going to give you one or the other. You can either see outside really well, or you can see inside really well. And this is the reason why we advise you not to shoot a interview or something in front of a window, because it's going to be very difficult to find a balance between both the indoors and the outdoors. So I want to show you a news story that was done with a reporter covering a restaurant. And when they were shooting this, they were indoors and there were a lot of windows in the background. So you can look at the background and see how overexposed everything is outside. So we'll take a look at that.
Just off U.S. Highway 231 in Troy, if you follow the smoke from its chimney, you'll find Hook's Barbecue. This local favorite has found its way into the Alabama Tourism Department's book, Alabama
So you can
Barbecue,
see in the windows outside, everything
trips.
is very
And his loyal
overexposed and hard to see.
know why.
I got some North Alabama roots, and I've always enjoyed barbecue North Alabama, and this reminds me of that barbecue as well.
I like the sauce on it. It's just a great tender meat, and I love it.
On a typical day, folks line up to chow down with barbecue done the old-fashioned way.
Primitive caveman cooked with fire. Now we're a little more advanced than that, but it still is. I mean, it's meat cooked over an open flame.
The folks at Hook's slow cook their meat on this huge brick pit, and the smell of barbecue and that slow cooked goodness can't be missed.
A lot of barbecue places may use hickory, mesquite, but we use oak exclusively. We think that's the best flavor, the best smoke.
And whether it's the pork being sliced and diced, that tender chicken, or the ribs cooked just right, you can't go wrong.
It is an art. I mean, it's like a musician's instrument. You get the fire and canvas of a painter. I mean, that's what we work with.
You know, the great thing about barbecue is you don't always have to eat it inside the restaurant. I like to get it to go sometimes, so I thought I'd take a trip here to my family's farm in Pike.
So I'm going to pause this for a moment and I'll pop into the screen. So one of the things that's kind of happened here that it's hard to notice is that as he's pulled his truck in, he's actually moved underneath the shade of the tree. So I can look at his shoulders and I can look at his face, and I can see that the video is a lot darker than everything that's happening around outside of him, around the lake on the grass. So he's actually moved into a darker area. And like shooting in front of a window, this is going to create a contrast ratio issue. Dog's getting excited. And so with this, it's also going to cause a problem for the camera, because the camera is going to try to find a balance for his face and his body, but it's also going to try to find a balance for what's going on outside. And in this case, it wind up having to iris up a little bit, letting in a little more light so that you could see his face. But it's also starting to make everything around him a little bit too overexposed.
County, and dig into what I'm told you have to have if you have nothing else at Hooks, and that's the ribs. Slow cooked over that oak wood fire for hours and hours. Tender and juicy, I'm told. Let's give it a shot. Just enough of that smoke to get into the meat, but not to overpower it. Just enough salt, just enough seasoning, just enough vinegar.
So I'm going to pause this for a moment. And again, if you look around him and you can see the background, the sun has come out, things have gotten a good bit brighter. Even his shirt has gotten a little bit brighter. So the contrast ratio of the camera with him underneath the shade is still trying to adjust to make everything in the shot work, but it's doing so at the cost of the background. So the background is becoming too bright and overexposed as it tries to keep the darkness of his face balanced as well.
To really give it a unique taste, and it is tender too, but not too tender, but just enough that when you bite into it, it comes right off the bone. So the next time your taste buds are telling you, hey, go get me some barbecue, make a trip down to Hook's Barbecue in Troy. Try anything on the menu, from the pork to the chicken to all the fixins, but of course, get an order of these ribs. See what makes them a taste of the South. That's positively Alabama.
And Jeff was nice enough to bring some in, and it was delicious. And do remember to tune in next Thursday as Jeff wraps up his special series.
So with that, you were able to see during a story how the camera was having an issue between brightness and dark. And you'll run into that a lot of times, especially if you're shooting news events such as ribbon cuttings, groundbreakings. In the case of this image, we have a lot of people are sitting underneath a tent. And because of that, the light around the people in the tent is rather dark, as opposed to the people that are outside in the sun or in the background. So for the camera, we're trying to get a good balance of light and dark. And you can kind of see that in the background, the buildings are starting to get overexposed a little bit. So this is not necessarily an ideal situation to shoot in. So I would much prefer to have like a building maybe behind them that would be relatively close to where they were. So if this building were closer, or if they had moved the tent further back so that you're not dealing with a lot of extra light coming in, that would have been beneficial, but that's not the way they set this up. So this was the way in which we had to record the event. Now, this is an example of contrast ratio that's done relatively well, but you can kind of see again, in the windows, we are starting to get to that overexposed area. And they're able to pull a lot of this off because they're not seeing the bright sky behind the windows. The light is being kind of dimmed and diffused by the trees. So near the bottom, the trees are looking good, but up higher up where we're getting into the window and the skylines of our two images is where it's starting to get overexposed because all that extra light is coming in. And this is the reason why we say do not shoot in front of a window, because the camera cannot handle the contrast ratio. So you're either going to get overexposed background or you're going to have a very dark subject matter. Now, that being said, when is having an extreme contrast ratio a good thing, where you have that big difference between the light and the dark? Well, if you want to conceal someone's identity, if you have a subject who says, I'll talk, but I don't want my face seen, I don't want people knowing who I am, then you can use contrast ratio to your advantage. So in this case, they put him in front of a very bright window. The office that he's in, they have all the lights turned off so that there's going to be no light coming in front. And then they adjust the iris for the camera to give you a very offsetting contrast ratio. And this is a really good way to do a simple notion of concealing someone's identity. Another type of technology people use is they're going to like put a filter on their face to blur their face. So in the case of this individual, this woman was talking, and for anonymity purposes, she wanted her face blurred. And then when she was done, they wound up interviewing her coworker or her boss as well. And they blurred both of their faces. But in this story, they forgot she was sitting in the background. So now the TV station accidentally revealed her identity, and they were able to tell who she was, probably where she worked, and she lost the anonymity that she was hoping to obtain through that story. So we talked about contrast ratio, the light and the dark that comes into a camera. Now, another thing I want to talk about is what's known as the color temperature. And this is kind of how we see different types of colors, reds, yellows, and greens. And so these also include like different types of intensities. So when we look at sun or sunlight, it's going to come in different temperatures. So you've got bright sunlight, which is about 56 K or Kelvin on the temperature scale. It's more intense than overcast light, where you have like clouds coming in and filtering. But the clouds surprisingly give you a hotter video at 6,500 K. Now, with bright sunlight, it's going to create shadows, and these can be hard shadows and very directional. So if you ever look out at your shadow on a sunny day and you see a very definitive outline of like your fingers or your body, this is a hard shadow that's being created by direct light. Now, if the clouds come out and they filter the sunlight so you don't have that, and you look at your shadow again of like your hand or your body, and it's just sort of like a dark, blurry shadow. There's no detail to it. This is what's called diffused or a soft shadow. And this is being created by light that's being kind of diffused and scattered. Now, with sunlight, it's not really a good background. And this is why we tell you not to shoot indoors, again, because that light temperature is coming into play. Now, when I talk about temperature, I talked about terms like 56K, 65K. This came about from a British physicist named William Kelvin back in the late 1800s. And he was working with a block of carbon, and he heated the carbon up. And he noticed that the block of carbon went from black, and then it started turning red. And then it started turning yellow as it got hotter, and then it went into blue, and then it went into white. And so he turned the temperature back down, and he noticed that it went from white back to blue, back to yellow, back to red. And he kept playing around with this, and he noticed that every time it got to a certain temperature, it would be red. Every time it got to a certain temperature, it would turn blue. And he could manually and always accurately turn the coal to a certain temperature, and it would reach that certain color. So he created a scale of this, and this is what's known as the Kelvin scale. Now, for his scale, he starts at what's known as absolute zero, which is about negative 273 degrees centigrade. And this is a point where things cannot get any colder. Now, the other end of the scale goes up into tens of hundreds of thousands, and it covers a wide range of temperatures and likewise a wide range of colors. So when we're dealing with the world of television and lighting, we're going to reference light colors in a realm of Kelvin scale. So we may talk about something being 32K or 56K. And that's because that's the type of color that it's sort of giving off. So in the realm of the 1000s, you've got things like your pinks and your reds. When we deal with 32K, we're starting to get into incandescence and candlelight, that sort of yellowish orange. And then when we move into 56K, we're starting to move into the blues and the whites that you see in fluorescent lights and daylight. There's going to be a large gap of light spectrum that we cannot even see. Things like in the ultraviolet should probably come in about the 10, 15, 20,000. But in the world of television, we tend to deal with two main color temperatures, either 32, which is a good indoor lighting, or 56, which is a good outdoor lighting. And you can modify the lights to accommodate that color temperature. So this is why if you look at a light bulb, some light bulbs are really bright and have a bluish, whitish light, as opposed to other lights that kind of have that yellowish orange light, because that's the color temperature that they are putting out. And you're going to need to set up your camera to accommodate for that color, because different things look, because objects look different under different lights. So if I'm under a yellow light, it's going to make my complexion, my skin have that more yellowish tinge. If I'm under the bluish and the whitish light, again, it's going to look different because I have a bluer light on me than I do with the yellow light. So as I'm going to talk about in other videos, that you're going to need to adjust your color temperature depending on what you want to use. So that's just a brief, that's a look at kind of how television lighting is accepted and recorded in both the human eye and the camera, and what the difference is and why you're going to need to be able to compensate for things like color temperature and aspect ratio